Hello and welcome to this screencast on presentation skills. My name's Kate and I'm one of the learning advisors here at the Skills Centre. I've worked in education and training for over 20 years, writing and delivering presentations to all sorts of groups on an almost daily basis. So whilst I don't have all the answers and I'm definitely not perfect, I'm hoping that I can share some of the lessons I've learned from my experience with you as we go through this presentation. Glossophobia. Did you know that as many as 75% of people may experience this? The term comes from the Greek glosso, which means tongue, and phobos, which means dread. What am I talking about? Yes, glossophobia is also known as fear of public speaking or fear of giving presentations. So if you are someone who experiences this, then you're definitely not alone. And even if you don't actually dread it, you're probably watching this screencast because you want to develop your presentation skills and maybe increase your confidence. So, what will we be covering in this session? Well, the 3 key learning outcomes for the screencast are outlined here. So by the end, you will have considered the benefits of being able to deliver a good presentation. Not just the benefits for getting through university, but kind of beyond that. And also the key characteristics of what will make your presentations good. We'll also then cover some tips on how to plan and structure presentations effectively, as well as some practical strategies for combating nerves and coming across with confidence, even if that's not what you feel inside. Okay, so we'll get started and we'll think firstly about the benefits and what makes a good presentation. Some people actually prefer giving presentations as it allows them to communicate verbally, which may be their preferred channel of communication. But regardless of this, giving a presentation in person allows you to make use of aspects such as pace and tone of voice and facial expressions, which can all enable you to present your ideas with more passion, feeling, or enthusiasm. It gives a chance for your personality to come across more easily than when you have to convey your ideas in writing. If you're trying to persuade or convince someone about something in your presentation, this can be a real advantage. You're possibly watching this because you've been given a presentation assignment to complete as part of your course, or maybe just for general interest and development. But regardless of achieving success at university, being able to plan and present an effective presentation is a skill that may also help you succeed in things like job interviews and in the workplace, as it's a skill which is often required in those settings too, perhaps even social occasions. So being able to overcome your nerves and deliver an effective presentation can be a confidence boost to you as well. So if you're able to push outside of your comfort zone and be successful, or even just reasonably successful, then this will help you to grow and develop, and it improves your confidence as you see this process happening. Okay, so what are the features of a bad presentation? Well, it's likely that you'll have been on the receiving end of at least one bad presentation. Have a think for a moment what was bad about it. Maybe, if you like, pause this screencast and note down some quick thoughts and bullet points. What were the characteristics of that bad presentation? And what felt bad about it from your perspective as an audience member? When we think about all the things that make a presentation bad, we find that we can generally just reverse these or flip them, and we'll identify what a good presentation should look and feel like. So for example, if a bad presentation does not engage the audience, if it's boring or delivered in a dull, monotone way, then what we need to do clearly is reverse this. So it needs to be interesting, delivered in an appropriately enthusiastic way with some passion, some variation in the tone of voice, for example. If a bad presentation leaves you feeling lost and as though you're not sure what the point is or what the argument the presenter is actually putting forward is, then a good presentation should have a clear and logical structure that's easy for you to follow. Additionally, I'd suggest that a good presentation is well researched so that the information is accurate and trustworthy, not just the opinion of the presenter. And from a practical point of view, Presentation slides should not be too busy, like on the last slide, with lots of small text, or crowded with multiple images. So a careful choice of colour schemes can make your presentations easier to read. So for example, red text on a green background is really difficult to see, and also will cause accessibility issues for anyone who's colourblind. A final point here is that presentations should stick to the time limit. There's a famous saying about presentations that's been attributed to Martin Luther King. When he was talking about preaching, he apparently said, "You should stand up, speak up, and shut up." Okay, let's move on now to our second objective for this screencast. We will start thinking about how to plan and structure to make your presentation effective. There are three things you should really think about before you even start thinking about researching your topic or planning your structure. And these are, firstly, know who the audience is. This will help you set the level of formality or the type of language you should be using. So for example, think about how this would change if you were delivering to 50 potential new students, and compare that to how you might speak if you were delivering to 5 experienced academics. So the prior knowledge or level of prior knowledge or not will help you determine how much explaining you need to do versus how much you can assume that your audience have a lot of knowledge about the topic already. Understanding the purpose of the presentation, so is it to inform, is it to persuade, is it to entertain people? Identifying that will help you focus on what you need to cover and how. Here's a fundamental structure for all presentations, and you'll probably see it's very much the same as a structure for an essay or a report. So we use an introduction to tell our audience what is coming up and what to expect during the presentation. This is where we tell them what we're going to tell them. Then we'll tell them, and obviously that's the main body of the presentation. And finally, we'll sum up with a conclusion which recaps the key points again. So here we're telling them what we've just told them. Whilst most students know that an essay needs an introduction and conclusion, sometimes this is forgotten when it comes to delivering a presentation. So just bear this presentation structure 101 in mind, and that will give you an immediate structure for your presentation. Another idea that's a really useful technique for structuring presentations, and it's a useful planning and structuring tool, it's called the rule of 3. So the idea here is that the rule of 3 is something that's deeply ingrained in so much of our everyday life. If you think about storytelling, we've got the 3 bears, the 3 little pigs, 3 musketeers, genies granting 3 wishes. Ideas such as around road safety, we're told to stop, look and listen. As I deliver this screencast, the government's message about COVID-19 is stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. So again, those 3 elements. We find it in humour as well, things like the 3 Stooges, the 3 Amigos, perhaps 3 Men and a Baby. Some of these cultural references may be familiar to you or maybe unfamiliar, depending on your experience. But hopefully you can see that this idea of clusters of 3 are quite prevalent, and the sort of theory behind this is that they prove to be more memorable, perhaps more catchy, more rhythmic. Even the structure of the presentation I mentioned earlier from Martin Luther King, stand up, speak up, shut up. So we can see this rule of 3 applies in many different settings. So we can use that to our advantage when we're designing and delivering a presentation. So here are some examples of how you could make use of that rule of 3. So firstly, you could divide your presentation into 3 key points or topics. And then you could divide each of those topics with 3 subpoints, perhaps. Maybe an idea of sticking to no more than 3 bullet points per page, like you can see on this slide that we're looking at here and on some of the others in the presentation. This also helps to sort of control you from being too busy and putting too much information. If you're only allowed 3 bullet points, think carefully about the 3 key things that you would want to say. You might want to use 3 statements. This is another way of applying the rule of 3. For example, what happened, why did it happen, and what can we learn from it? So I'm going to show you a more sort of visual way of representing what the presentation structure might look like with the rule of 3 also applied. So the introduction would cover the title and the contents of the presentation, so the tell them what you're going to tell them part. And a rough rule would be that this should take up about 5% of the time that you've got for delivery. So for a 10-minute presentation, that would be about 30 seconds. The main body of the presentation could be divided into 3 sections, each with 3 key points, as I mentioned previously. So for a 10-minute presentation, this should take up about 9 minutes, so it's 90% of the time that you've been allocated. So that would give you 1 minute for each point. Got 9 points in total to make. And then finally, the conclusion section, the end part would be about the same length and size as the introduction, so maybe another 30 seconds in your 10-minute presentation example. So for a 10-minute presentation, we've got a 30 seconds introduction, a 30 seconds conclusion, and 9 minutes of content, giving us 1 minute per point. So you don't have to apply this absolutely strictly, but it gives you a good idea of the kind of relative proportions of the beginning, middle, and the end. And it can be a useful starting point to make sure you don't cram too much information into the presentation so that you're rushing through or overwhelming the audience with far too much information on each slide. So I'm going to look in a bit more detail at the opening part of the presentation, talk about something called an opening statement. I mentioned earlier about a good presentation being interesting, so it's really important to grab the audience's attention right at the start. I think we quickly make judgments about whether something is going to be interesting to us or not, and that can then impact on our attention. So starting with something that will get the audience's attention or maybe engage their curiosity will help them form a positive initial impression and then give their full attention to what you're saying. You're also aiming to fulfill the first task of your presentation structure here, so the tell them what you're going to tell them part. So you can explain what you're speaking about and why you're speaking about it. So think about why you were interested or passionate about the topic and aim to convey that with enthusiasm at the start. So if you're interested in the topic and the audience can see that, they're more likely to be interested in what you have to say. You could also offer a statistic or a statement, a kind of did you know, that sort of an approach to again sort of hook the audience's interest. You can see the image of the worm on the hook on this slide, and that's to represent that idea of hooking the audience's attention, hooking them into your presentation. So one final suggestion you could consider is framing your opening statement as a question, kind of like what if or have you ever wondered, that sort of approach. So other things to include in your introduction. Well, once you've got the audience's attention, you can go on to give them some other important information or signposting about who you are. So remember to introduce yourself. Even if you're presenting to tutors who do know you, it's good practice and gives a professional impression to introduce yourself formally. Tell them what the presentation will cover and what they can expect in terms of timing and structure. Okay, let's move on to the main content of the presentation. So I've selected this image of this huge sandwich because the middle part of the presentation is clearly the biggest chunk. If you remember that 90% 5 and 5 kind of proportion. So the filling of your sandwich is the main event. And so this is where your research and your argument is going to be presented and making up the bulk of the presentation. So just like you would in a written assignment, you should try to present your ideas in some sort of logical order so that one point follows on nicely from the previous one, rather than jumping around from different topic to different topic in what seems to be a random order. So think about the order that you're putting your points into. Why does it make sense to start in a certain place and to move through in that order? When you're developing the content for this main part of your presentation, this is where you're going to need to do quite a bit of research, but it's really important to make sure you fully understand the brief that you've been given before you dive into the research. So what is it you're being asked to do? After all, a presentation is really simply a different format by which to answer an assignment question. So you might want to use a highlighter to highlight keywords in the assignment brief, just as maybe you would do if you had a written assignment. Think carefully about what the question is actually asking you. Don't just zone in, focus in on the topic and then try to write everything you know about the topic. So once you've identified what the question is really asking you to do, you might want to start to sort of brainstorm your current knowledge on the subject. So this could be bullet points or a mind map, just something to generate ideas and help a bit with the structure. Once you've identified what you already know, you can start thinking about what you don't know yet. And this is going to guide your research and reading. So trying to formulate some questions here could help with your reading so that you can search for the answers to those questions as you're reading. You can research using books, e-journals, obviously the web, but being careful to think about the reliability of the sources that you're using, lecture and tutorial notes, reading lists online, checking out the specific subjects that are related to the area you're presenting on. It's really important to keep track of where you found the information that you're planning to use in your presentation, as you will have to give references. So you could use coloured arrow post-it notes as bookmarks to highlight where you found things, or maybe just keep a separate list of references as you go along. You might want to make use of the software such as RefWorks to help you organise your references, and I would highly recommend that. If you're not sure how to use that, then the library offers information and training sessions on how to get started with RefWorks. So once you've done your research, you'll probably have a lot of content, and the next step really is planning, deciding what should go in, because you won't be able to put everything in that you found, and also deciding what is the best order to present that information. So mind mapping can be a useful technique here, and mind mapping software can be particularly useful because it enables you to get down your ideas, but also sort of play around with moving them around into a different order so that you can see what works best. You can do this manually by drawing a mind map or a flowchart, or one of my favourite ways of doing this is to use post-it notes and to put topics or headings on post-it notes or cards and then actually physically move them around into different order so I can experiment until I'm happy, thinking, well, if I put this here and then follow it with that, does that work better? So experiment and move things around until you feel happy with the order that you've put your information. You might want to think about that rule of 3 that I mentioned earlier to stop yourself from trying to cram too much in. So here's just an example of a mind map and how it might help you start developing key points and themes for a presentation. So you can start with your question or argument in the middle and then perhaps just identify some key points or themes. What is it you want to say about this question? Perhaps then try to narrow those down maybe to the 3 most important key points. Consider cutting out some of the points that are not required or not as important. So that's one way of keeping the presentation tightly focused and using the rule of 3. Just remember, you won't be able to cover everything, and if you try, your presentation will be overcrowded, your delivery will be rushed, and that's going to impact negatively on the communication of your message. So it's better to say 3 things really well than say 6 things badly. When you're planning the closing of your presentation, you can refer back to your opening message. Perhaps if you asked a question at the beginning, this is a time to clearly state what the answer is, summing up the answer, telling them what you've already told them. So just like in a written assignment, your conclusion should sum up the key points that you've already mentioned. It's not the place to be bringing in any new arguments or new information. So what might be new at this point in your conclusion could be any next steps you want to suggest that your audience might want to take. For example, you could signpost them towards further reading or make a suggestion about a direction for future research. Finally, you should always ask the audience if anyone has any questions they would like to ask you, and be prepared to answer them. So it can be useful to think ahead, what might people want to ask, and what answers do you have ready prepared. Okay, what's wrong with this slide? Well, the aim of this slide is to show the mistakes that a lot of people, including staff, make when using presentations. It can be even worse when the presenter goes on to read the slide word for word with their back to you in the room. I mean, it's pretty obvious that this slide is very hard to read and it has far too much content on it. So your presentation slides should be a visual aid. They should aid the audience in understanding and following what you're saying. So you need to display key points as bullets, which you then expand on as you're talking, rather than putting everything on the slide that you're going to say. You might wish to use a quote or a graphic, like a graph, as an image on the slide, and then talk around that. So tell us what that information shows. Or maybe you could put up a picture that has some relevance to what you're talking about. Unlike the one on this slide, yeah, it's a cute animal, but it doesn't have anything to do with the topic. You might find it helpful to write every word into your presentation whilst you're planning, but then you need to turn it into short statements or bullet points. You might want to keep that full information, that kind of script, as part of your notes pages, and in PowerPoint there is a space below the slides where you can type that information. So it can be really useful for planning what you're going to say, but keep what's on the slides down to the minimum. So just to summarize, what does make for effective visual aids? We've seen kind of what not to do. Firstly, use a font size that's nice and big. Around size 28 to 32 is ideal for a PowerPoint. You also maybe want to think about a typeface which is clear and not too fussy. So Arial is quite a good choice. Think about the background colours, which will contrast with the text. So a dark font on a light background usually works quite well. And just avoid cluttering the slides. We've talked about that rule of 3. But just remember there needs to be plenty of kind of space around the text. And if you're using pictures or images, they need to be large enough so that they can be seen from the audience's perspective. Finally, just try and be consistent with your layout and style. It can be really distracting and looks kind of unprofessional if you keep changing from one style to another. So less is more. Right, so we're going to move on now to the third and final section of this screencast. So I'm going to try and give you some practical tips to help you deal with nerves and make you feel more confident in your presentations. Firstly, something about group presentations. If you are presenting as a group, it is important, really important, to rehearse together because that's what you're going to be doing on the day. In the planning stage, when you're dividing up the presentation between you, think about maybe sharing out the topics rather than saying 3 minutes each or whatever, because some topics might take slightly more or less time. And there'll be a kind of clear rationale for the division between each of the speakers if each person has their own sort of discrete subtopic. When you're delivering as a group, it's good practice to introduce everyone at the beginning rather than letting each person introduce themselves when it's their turn. So introduce everyone at the beginning and say who's doing what, which section are they delivering. That way you don't need to break up the flow of the presentation once it's started by sort of introducing each person in the middle. It might seem obvious, but really make sure you listen to each other during the presentation. It's respectful and professional, and it'll make the presentation flow better if you're really tuned in to what has been said by other people before it gets to your bit. Try to ensure that handovers are smooth and polite, so think about what you're going to say, something like, now I'll hand you over to Jack, who will talk about the impact of the research. Overall, always just remember you're working as a team, a single unit delivering a single presentation, not several individuals doing several presentations. So that's why it's really important that you've got good communication within your team during the planning and the preparation, as well as during the delivery. If you've got a chance to practice together beforehand, I really recommend that you take that chance. It just helps you ensure things fit together, and it will give you confidence when delivering on the day. You may have been given the option to bring notes into your presentation to help you in your delivery. So have a think about, if you've been given that option, have a think about how you want to use those notes and what's the best format to have them in. You need to ensure that any notes you bring are concise. You might want to write out a full script first, but then I'd really encourage you to condense that down into some bullet points or short statements to ensure that you're not just reading out word for word from your cards or your notes. If you are using cards, you can hole punch them and sort of put a string through the corner or a treasury tag to hold them together. If you're using paper, staple it together at the corner. The reason I say this is because if you do accidentally drop the pages and they're not connected together and they kind of all come out of order, that can be a really stressful experience. Maybe considering numbering the cards or the pages, or just trying to use one card or one page per slide so that you can keep track. If you practice with your notes enough, you may find that you don't actually need to refer to your notes, that you do know what it is that you're going to say, but you might feel you want to have them available to you if that gives you confidence. So practice builds confidence. The more you practice, the more confident you'll become. It's the same with anything, isn't it? The more we do something, the better we get at it. So knowing that you're well prepared can really help to ease your anxiety. Take some time to practice your presentation out loud, either by yourself or with a friend or family member or classmate, anyone who's willing to listen and be constructive in their sort of feedback or criticism. If the presentation overruns when you're practicing, you can think about how can you summarize some of the points, or maybe not cover every single point that's on the slides. If you've written lots of notes or a longhand sort of full script of your presentation, try to summarize those for your notes or cards. But you can copy the whole of that text into the presenter notes on PowerPoint, so that when you hand your PowerPoint file in, when you upload it up to Blackboard, your tutor will be able to see that level of preparation that you did when you submit the assignment. Final thing you can do when practicing is anticipate what kind of questions might be asked and practice answering them. The next 3 slides contain some practical tips regarding preparing for delivering your presentation and managing your nerves on the day. First of all, wear comfortable and breathable clothing. It can help you not to overheat, which is something that can happen if you get nervous. It's really important to arrive early so that you can test the technology you'll be using. I would always say take your presentation on a memory stick and email it to yourself to a web-based email like a Gmail or a Yahoo that you can access from any computer that has internet access. That way you've always got a backup. If you're using sound, check that that's working beforehand. If you're going to link out to any links on the internet as part of the presentation, open up the links beforehand. Again, just check that they're working. This can also help prevent sort of a long pause while you're waiting for something to open. Have it ready, open in the background. Having a plan B about the technology is really important. think about what you're going to do if the technology lets you down. You know, I've been presenting for over 20 years and this has happened to me. It hasn't happened that often, but it has happened. So having handouts maybe with printout of the slides on that you could give out to people. If it's a video you're planning to show, is there a transcript of that video that you could give out and have people read, for example? If there's something you really wanted to show, can you have a printed out copy of the picture just so that you've got a backup? So always have a plan B and maybe a plan C as well. Okay, the last point, the I am excited mantra. This refers to a way of harnessing your sort of nervous energy and making it work for you. So physically, anxiety and excitement are really similar to each other. So when we're anxious or when we're excited, we might have kind of raised heart rate, and that's because of an increase in adrenaline produced by the body. So when your body's experiencing those sort of physical signs, if you tell yourself, I'm excited, this can help your brain to interpret any sort of nervous energy in your body positively. This also might be known as fake it until you make it, but it is actually based on principles from cognitive psychology, which tell us that our thoughts and our feelings, our behavior and our physiology are all connected to each other. So what we tell ourselves impacts on how we're feeling. We can reduce our anxiety, we can almost convince ourselves that what we're feeling is excitement. If you want to know more about the research behind this, you can click on the link on this slide. It takes you to a piece of research which demonstrated that when people reappraised their nervousness as excitement, it did actually lead to better performance in a range of different settings. So quite interesting, and it may give you confidence to kind of feel the fear and do it anyway. So next, some tips for when you're actually delivering the presentation. Remember to speak at a steady pace. So when you're nervous, it's quite common for people to start speaking more quickly. It's because your subconscious might be trying to just get it over with as quickly as possible. So if this happens to you, make a conscious effort to speak a bit more slowly than you think you need to. Taking deep breaths can help to calm you, and it also helps you to project your voice more effectively. A clear, audible voice gives credibility and professionalism to your presentation. If you're pausing to take a deep breath, don't worry. You know, a pause in a presentation can be really useful for the audience. It just gives them a moment to kind of absorb and digest what you've just told them. So the pause might feel long to you, but will probably not feel as long for the audience. So just take your time. Try to make eye contact with the audience. Maybe look for a friendly face if you know that there's going to be someone who fits that description there. Again, the reason for this is because eye contact can make the audience feel engaged with you and what you're saying. If you find it difficult or uncomfortable to make direct eye contact when presenting, you can try looking over the tops of people's heads. From the distance that they'll be, they really won't be able to tell the difference. The main thing I think is to avoid sort of looking down and speaking down into your notes or into the floor, or even worse, turning your back on the audience while you're presenting. Okay, final top tips for dealing with nerves. Have some water available. It's really useful in case your voice cracks or your throat goes dry, which again can happen if you're nervous. Just taking a sip of water can buy you a moment of time to collect yourself if necessary, and it can help stop you from rushing. No one's going to mind if you pause for a sip of water. Try to avoid fidgeting if you can, as that can be really distracting for the audience. For example, if you've got coins in your pocket and you're sort of jingling them. One suggestion is to hold on to something like a pen or your notes or a water bottle. When you're holding on to something, your mind has to subconsciously focus on not dropping that object, and that can make you less likely to fidget. Lastly, take one good deep breath after each slide. Don't forget to breathe. Okay, so some resources to develop your skills further, kind of beyond having watched this screencast. If you would like to practice your presentation in a small group setting and receive feedback from other students and one of our tutors at the Skills Centre, you can book onto one of our presentation skills forums. So you can book on as an individual and share the session with the other individuals who have booked. Or if you are delivering a presentation in a group, then you can book as a small group. So that will give you a chance to run through together and get some feedback. So these forums are really useful. They just give that opportunity for a run through, some feedback in a friendly and supportive setting. Some books that are available in the Skills Centre collection in the Hallam Library that we recommend as sort of good additional resources are listed here. So the Presentation Workout by Kate Atkin and James Schofield's Presentation Skills book are a couple that I would recommend for starters. I've also put some further kind of e-learning resources on Greek work and presentations on here as links for you to follow. So one of these is from the Skills for Study Campus resource, which you just need to log into with your normal student login. And the other is produced by ourselves here at the Skills Centre. Lastly, if you want to watch a TEDx talk, on a video, then this one that I've linked to here is really recommended. So just click on the link to take you out into the YouTube. So to practice what I've been preaching, I'm going to end this screencast by reminding you what we've covered. So I'm going to tell you what I've told you. We covered the benefits. So for getting through your course, passing your assignment, and also the benefit of being good at presentations for other settings and throughout life and work. Then we talked about planning and following a good structure, how to make use of the rule of 3, and making sure there's a clear beginning, middle, and end for your presentation. And thirdly, we looked at various strategies and tips for dealing with your nerves and for coming across as confident. So I really hope you've gained some useful ideas and tips that you'll be taking forward when preparing and delivering your next presentation. I've popped the contact details for the Skills Centre on this slide, so if you've got any further questions or you want to get in touch, you can do so via the website, email or Twitter. And the references for the presentation and links to some other resources are on the following 2 slides. So I'll leave you to look at those at your leisure. But for now, thanks for watching this screencast. Good luck in your presentations, and I look forward to perhaps meeting you in a presentation forum. Thank you. Goodbye.